Welcome to the Orchard Online. We are so happy you are joining us today. If this is your first time tuning in, we want to say welcome. Feel free to drop a comment below, and we have someone that's ready to pray with you. This is going to be week 2 of our new sermon series, One Another's. Here's Pastor Matt.
Well, we're back with this new series that we're in titled One Another's. In fact, if you missed week 1, I would encourage you to stop right here and go back and watch that so you have a full understanding of what we're talking about when we say one another's. The fact of the matter is, all throughout the New Testament, we see this phrase, one another, but it's usually qualified, or it usually begins with a certain specific action or a certain specific word. Last week we began and we saw that the church, and that is a loaded term for us today, but the church in its full essence and its understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, this gathering of people that we belong to one another. The way that Paul says it in Romans 12 is that we are members one of another. And we are members like a body has hands and feet and eyes and ears, where we belong to one another, that we make up one entity known as the church, and yet we play individual parts for individual functions within that body. Well, this week we get to this new phrase, not a new phrase because it's new to us, but a new phrase in this series, and the phrase is love one another. The fact is that last week's message that we belong to one another because of who Jesus is now makes it possible for the rest of these commandments. And we'll talk about these for the next couple weeks. But if you don't understand that you belong together, not you're suggested to belong together, but by definition, when you come to faith in Jesus, you now belong to a much larger gathering known as the church, which is likened to a body. That if you understand that now, this message today, that you love one another, almost like raises the bar for us. And what I mean is, it's one thing to say, okay, I understand the concept of belonging to other people who follow Jesus, other people who call Jesus Lord. Like, I understand the concept that we belong to each other. But the question then is, but what does that mean? Does that mean that we just sit in the same rooms on Sundays? Does that mean that we just kind of all post the same Bible verses? Does that mean that we just kind of like give each other a secret handshake or a secret hand wave and that's the extent of it? Well, today we'll see that these ideas, these commands of love one another, or these one another's that we'll see for the next couple weeks, that it actually raises the bar of what does it mean to not only belong to one another, but how do we live in relation to one another? And so today we look specifically at this idea of love one another, and we understand that loving one another is possible because we belong to one another. And specifically, when we say we belong to one another, we say that we belong to Jesus and you belong to Jesus, so therefore we together belong together because we together both belong to Jesus. But today we're looking at love one another, and we're going to be in John chapter 13. Now, before I read the verses, I want to kind of paint the picture of what's happening in John 13. Well, first and foremost, Jesus knows that his end is coming soon. Now, he understands, and he's been preparing his disciples for really all throughout the Gospels, all throughout his ministry. He's kind of been dropping these hints, sometimes very plain, and yet they didn't just quite understand what he was saying. Well, in this moment, in John chapter 13, Jesus is in the upper room. This is the setting of the Last Supper, or the Lord's Supper, if you know that story, if you know your church history, if you know your Bible. And Jesus is there with his disciples, these 12 that he has spent the last 13 years with, teaching them, instructing them, commanding them to go out and to do these things that he's told them to do, allowing them to sit back and to watch him as he interacts with other people or he performs miracles. They have had a front row seat to Jesus for these last 3 years. Well, Jesus knows that the end of those 3 years is coming up. And so beginning in John chapter 13, actually these 4 chapters in John through chapter 17, Jesus is preparing his disciples, specifically telling them, hey, guys, in a little while you're not going to see me anymore. Hey, my end is coming soon. And so he's preparing them for life without him. And right after that, in John chapter 13, this is the well-known chapter where Jesus actually takes the form of a servant and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. A task that, by Peter's reaction, we know, would take them aback because, Jesus, you don't do this. This is the job of a servant. Why are you doing this? I won't allow you to wash my feet. Right after that, as he prepares them for his departure, Jesus makes known to his disciples that somebody seated at the table will betray him. Now, they don't know exactly who this person is until afterwards, and they look back, and John will tell us ultimately that it is Judas. But while sitting at this table during this Last Supper, this Lord's Supper together, Jesus makes known to his disciples that, hey, my end is coming near, but also the reason for that is because somebody at this table will betray me. And then, right after he says that, he says to Judas, what you're going to do, go and do quickly. Now, the disciples don't understand exactly what that means, but of course we know, looking back, that Judas is the one who would betray Jesus. And so Jesus dismisses Judas from the table. And that's where we pick up in John chapter 13. We're going to look at verses 31 through 35. And this is how 31 begins. When he had left, that is Judas, Jesus says to him, what you're going to do quickly. So Judas gets up and he leaves. After Judas leaves, Jesus says these words, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Now, we read that and we scratch our heads and we furrow our brow and we're saying, well, I don't really understand what he's saying here. It seems kind of like glorified, and then he's glorified and God glorifies him, and it can seem somewhat confusing. Suffice it to say, as best as I can, to summarize, here's what Jesus is saying. Jesus knows that his time has come. The very reason that he came to the earth, we just celebrated Christmas not too long ago. The reason that we celebrate his coming is because he came to die. He came to die. He knows that God's redemptive plan ultimately culminates with his death on a Roman cross, where he pays the price of our sin, where our consequences are taken upon Jesus, and he satisfies the wrath of God towards us so that we have the hope of forgiveness and salvation. And yet, interestingly, when Jesus speaks of his crucifixion, he doesn't speak of it in terms of humiliation, which ultimately it would be humiliating because he is crucified naked for all of the world to see. He's beaten and spit on. He's made a mockery of. And yet, for Jesus, with the way he sees crucifixion is not through a lens of humiliation, it's through glorification. Jesus knows that his time has come, but he knows that this is the very purpose for which he came, that God's redemptive plan would soon be carried out through his exalting, lifted up on a Roman cross. And so he says to them, now the Son of Man is glorified. Judas has left. This redemptive plan is set into motion. And soon I will be lifted up and God will be glorified because his redemptive plan will be carried out. Because Jesus knows what awaits him, he is now preparing his disciples for life without him. Look in verse 33. He refers to them as little children. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. He's telling them, hey, the time is coming. The clock is ticking. You will look for me, and just as I have told the Jews, so now I tell you, where I am going, you cannot come. Again, Jesus is preparing his disciples that, hey, I know what's coming, and I am preparing you for life without me. Jesus refers to these disciples, by the way, grown men sitting around a table, as little children. This term of endearment. You can hear the emotion in his voice that it's almost like, hey, a father here who is speaking to his children. And he's telling them things that they don't yet understand, but in many ways they're little children now, but they're about to come of age because soon they will go out on their own. Soon they will go and they will do the work of ministry that Jesus has been preparing them to do for the last 3 years. Soon they will live without having Jesus to fall back on and to come and to rescue them from situations, much like he did throughout the Gospels. Jesus has been preparing them this whole time, but finally the time has come. And as part of this final preparation, Jesus gives the disciples a command that we've already mentioned, and is found in verse 34. He says to them, as part of his preparation for leaving them, I give you a new command, love one another. Now, we read this, and it's not that the command of love is new. In fact, the command of love your neighbor as yourself, we often quote that in the New Testament because Jesus did. And he said that this is the second command. When he was asked what is the greatest command, he says to love your neighbor as yourself. But that passage that Jesus quotes is actually found all the way back in the Old Testament in Leviticus. And so when Jesus says, I give you a new command, it's not that the idea of loving other people or loving one another, that's not a new concept for them. And so Jesus will expound on this. Well, then why is it new? Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we do that, this command of love one another, I think for us at first glance, especially if you're like me and you grew up in church, this just sounds like a very churchy thing to say. Oh, love one another. It sounds a lot like Star Trek where it says, live long and prosper. It's this thing that sounds good and it feels good, but like, what does that really mean? If we're being honest, love one another sounds like something you would be expected to hear in church, and yet we can ask ourselves, but what does this actually mean? It seems like a very simple concept. It's very simple to comprehend. Oh, love one another, but what does that mean? How do I love one another? Who do I love? Do I have to love everybody the same way? Do I love my family different than I love other people? And so it sounds very churchy. It sounds very simple. And yet, I'm not sure we know right off the bat, what does this mean? Well, that's exactly why Jesus says, I give you a new command. Not that the concept of loving is new, but look what he says in the next part of this verse. In verse 34, I give you a new command, love one another. Okay, very churchy thing to say. It's something that I would think Jesus would say. But this is what he says next. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. So the newness here is not the concept of loving other people. The newness here is they are about to understand love in a whole new context. Love is about to be defined for them in ways that they had never seen before. And so I think it's important for us to ask the question, okay, this context, this command of love one another is built into the fabric of who Jesus is and what he had done for the disciples. Love one another. Okay, check. Yeah, that's a church thing to say. But in this way, just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. Now, why does this matter? Because Jesus is talking to a group of guys who had been with him for 3 years. They had seen Jesus do a lot of things. They had heard Jesus teach a lot of things. They had seen him perform miracles. They had seen him correct people and confront the Pharisees. They had seen him do all kinds of things over the course of 3 years. And so now when Jesus says love one another, he gives them a framework to say, okay, for the past 3 years, think back to everything that I have done for you and all the ways that I have loved you. And now life without me, you've been prepared in ways that you didn't even know. Now go and do like I have done for you. Love one another just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. Now I want to stop here because if we're being honest, in our society today, and I speak this way because I am a man, love often carries a romantic or effeminate connotation. In other words, as a man, I think in our culture today, like the idea of love is for romance movies on Netflix, or it's how women talk to each other around the table. Oh, I just love you. I love your hair, all that kind of stuff. But you have to understand that when Jesus says love one another, this is not a suggestion. This is not just for the women of the church. This is not just this effeminate feeling that you feel for other people. Jesus says this in the context of 11 guys sitting around a table. And some of these guys were rough around the edges kind of guys. Some of these guys were blue-collar fishermen type of guys. And Jesus looks at these guys and he says this, love one another. Well, how do I do that? What does that mean? Is that like this romantic feeling? He says, just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. This is not a suggestion that is just a churchy thing to say. This is the very fabric of what it means to be a part of the church and how we live in relation to one another as the church. Jesus redefines this concept of love. He doesn't say that love is love and love is whatever you make it to be. He says that love has been demonstrated for you in the ways that I have loved you. So as you go and love other people, do so in the same way that I have loved you. I think for us, that begs the question, well then how had Jesus loved them? When Jesus says this, he's speaking to them over the course of 3 years worth of data for them to go back and to look through and to think through. Here are just a couple things that come to mind. How did Jesus love them up to this point? Well, I think for one, Jesus taught them and he told the truth. Jesus told the truth, and sometimes that meant upsetting people. Sometimes that meant getting in hot water with people like the Pharisees. Sometimes that meant offending people. But Jesus told the truth. He was a truth teller. And through his teaching of the truth, we can see that that was actually done in love because he wants for them what they may not even want for themselves. He knows what they don't yet know. And so one of the ways in which Jesus loved the disciples, but also other people, was he told the truth. And sometimes the truth was offensive, and yet Jesus told the truth because ultimately he wanted what was best for them. Another way in which Jesus loved, especially the disciples up to this point, is through warnings. Jesus gave them warnings. I remember in the Gospels, it hadn't happened yet by the timeline of this particular instance, but one of the ways that stands out to me that Jesus warned the disciples is where he says to them that Satan would sift you like wheat. And so that's a warning. And so the follow-up to that is, therefore, you need to pray and you need to ask God to be with you and to help you because you have an enemy who would sift you like wheat. That's a warning that Jesus offers. I think about the end of Matthew's gospel where he tells about the kingdom that is to come, where he tells about these end times and he is warning them about things that will take place. One of the ways in which Jesus loved the disciples is that he warned them. He didn't allow them just to walk face first into these traps. He warned them about things to watch out for, things to be careful of. Another way that Jesus loved the disciples was he empowered them. In fact, he sent them out 2 by 2 and he gave them authority and says, if you go into this place and do this, then I go with you and I am there with you and I give you the ability and the authority to go and to do things. In fact, sometimes they would even be able to perform miracles. They'd be able to cast out demons. Jesus loved them, and because he loved them, he empowered them. Another way that Jesus loved them was through his graciousness and his patience. I think about this time where they're out on the sea and some of them are fishermen and they're scared to death of like, hey, we're all going to die here. And they wake Jesus up in the middle of a storm. And the first thing he says to them is what? Oh, you of little faith. And it seems like in that moment, the storm is raging. They're fearing for their lives. And it's almost like Jesus is like, hey, are you guys do you not understand? Like I'm here with you. Do you think I'm just going to allow you to perish in the middle of the sea? You've already seen these miracles. You've seen the 5,000 fed. Oh, you of little faith. And yet he says it in such a way that conveys this graciousness and this patience, but almost in a way of like a gentle rebuke. Of like, okay, guys, it's almost like loving but firm pat on the back that says, hey, don't you know, like I'm with you. It's going to be okay. Oh, you of little faith, like your faith doesn't have to be small because of who I am. He also has full knowledge of their faults. I think about Peter. Again, it hasn't happened yet according to the timeline of John 13. But with full knowledge of their faults, Jesus called that Simon Peter to come be a fisherman of men. And he already knew at the end of his life that this same Peter would deny him 3 times. And we see this redemptive story at the end of John's gospel where then after Peter denies Jesus 3 times, Jesus comes back and he asks him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And yet with full knowledge of his faults, this gracious patience, Jesus has loved Peter through all of Peter's faults up to this moment, with full knowledge of everything that would happen, and yet Jesus graciously and patiently loves them through it. Jesus modeled behavior for them. He modeled how to pray. Matthew chapter 6, then pray like this. Don't pray like the Gentiles. Pray like this. Don't pray like the Pharisees who stand up in the streets. Pray like this. He modeled behavior for them. Jesus would often go out by himself and spend time with the Father through prayer. He modeled this for them. He modeled how do you respond to opponents and critics and enemies. How do you respond to these people who are coming against you and trying to trap you with questions and put you on the spot and all this? And Jesus modeled this for the disciples. They saw front row seat to all of his interactions with these people. But then ultimately, the way in which Jesus would model for them, love one another in the same way that I have loved you, is that in just a few hours' time, Jesus would be displayed on a Roman cross, his arms stretched out, his hands and his feet pierced with nails. He would be lifted up in humiliation by our standards. And yet he has already told them at this same table, in this same setting, that, hey, when you see my body broken for you, know that this is for you. When you see my blood shed for you, know that this is for you. Jesus commands these grown men around the table, hey, go and love one another as I have loved you. That love was also demonstrated through sacrifice, where Jesus would just in a few hours' time from this very setting, he would go to the cross and he would give his life in humiliation, in excruciating pain. He would do that and he's told them, I do this for you. I'm loving you in this way. Here's the thing that we need to understand about this command of love one another is that love is rooted in action. The ways that Jesus loved them wasn't based on romantic feelings. It was based on considering their needs. Therefore, he taught them and he told the truth. Therefore, he modeled behavior for them. Therefore, he prayed for them. Therefore, he took them out and he warned them. Therefore, he empowered them. And therefore, he gave his life for them. When Jesus gives this command to a bunch of guys sitting around the table to love one another, this is not some effeminate, romantic type of feeling inside of you. This is love that is rooted in action that considers the needs of other people. And that's what Jesus has in mind. Loving one another isn't just for you, though. It's for everyone else. Look how Jesus ends this encounter. In John chapter 13 and verse 35, he says this, love one another, just as I have loved you, you are to love one another. By this, by the way in which you love one another, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. I read one pastor and he said it this way, Jesus tells us that our corporate life, how we interact and relate to one another, is an apologetic, is a witness and a testimony to outsiders. In other words, people outside of the faith, people outside of the church, they look at the way that people inside of the church love one another in the same way that Jesus loved them. Not because they're all alike. We talked about that last week. Not because we all share the same hobbies and interests. No, but because we make the conscious decision to consider the needs of other people and we love them like Jesus. We love them in ways that sometimes looks like being able to tell the truth even though it's offensive. We love in the way that sometimes looks like warning against destruction or traps that lie ahead. We love by graciously and patiently enduring through the faults of other people and being willing to forgive. We love other people by willing to sacrifice sometimes our own personal preferences and desires for the sake of other people. In all of these ways, we love like Jesus loved, in the same way that I have loved you. Here's how I would say it is this. That when we love like Jesus, it is an indication that we are followers of Jesus. And Jesus says that everyone will know that you are my followers, you are my disciples if you love one another. Because when you love like Jesus, you become a visual testimony of who Jesus is and the power that He has to transform lives. And people around notice. So in a very interesting way, here's what Jesus says to us. That loving one another, not as a suggestion, not as that's just for the women to do all that romantic stuff. But Jesus seated around a table with a bunch of guys who spent 3 years with Him, preparing them for this moment. Jesus says to love one another in the same way that I have loved you, that loving one another paves the way for us as a church to live on mission. Here's what I mean. I mean that you will have a hard time living out this command of loving one another apart from a local gathering and a local body of believers. I mean that you will have a hard time living on mission, trying to tell other people about Jesus if they don't see the love of Jesus displayed through you in your relationship to other people. And so, loving one another, not as a suggestion, but realizing that Jesus gave this command to His disciples as part of their preparation for life without Him, that loving one another paves the way for living on mission. If you want to live on mission and you want people to know the Jesus that you know, then start looking inward and ask yourself, how am I loving other people inside the local church? How am I loving my brothers and sisters? Am I making conscious decisions through my actions to love them, not because of all the ways that we are alike, but in spite of our differences, am I willing to love them even like Jesus loved me? And if your goal is to live on mission, then loving one another paves the way for us to do so. But you will have a hard time living out this command apart from the local church. In other words, it's really hard for you to love one another if you only ever gather on your couch in front of your TV all by yourself and aren't a part of a local believers. So here's my encouragement to you. My encouragement to you is if you are a part of a local church, then to take seriously what Jesus says is to love one another and begin to think of all the ways in which He has loved the disciples and loved you, and then go and be that for somebody else. And then secondly, here's what I would say. If you have not yet found a local church, and I get it can be intimidating, you move to a new area, you don't know anybody, I understand there's some intimidation that goes along with that. Do your research, do your homework. The beauty of today's world is that almost everybody is online and virtual, and you can kind of see what you get before you get there. But here's what I would say. I would encourage you to take that bold step to reach out, to step out, and to find a local body in which you can live out this command to love one another. Why? Because loving one another paves the way for us to go and to do and to live on mission and to help other people know the Jesus that we know. Let me pray for you. God, we thank you for today. Lord, we thank you that we don't have to wonder what love looks like because we look to Jesus and we look to the cross and we see that love has been defined for us. Help us as your followers to go and to love one another in this way. To love one another in spite of our differences, in spite of our faults. Lord, that we would have patience, that we would be willing to sacrifice for, that we would be willing to tell the truth, that we would be willing to model behavior. Lord, that we would do all of these things as we look back to Jesus, that it would enable and equip us to love one another in that same way for the benefit not only of the church, but for the people outside of it. Lord, this is our prayer. Help us to do this. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, Matt, for that reminder that the best way we can love one another is through the context of the local church. Well, thanks again for joining us. We encourage you to check out one of our locations next week, but if not, we'll be right back here ready for you. Have a great week.